The Asia-Scotland Institute, which I and others in this room have been involved in getting going, started last year. And it started on the very simple premise that for this country, and by that I mean the United Kingdom, to engage properly, with Scotland within it, with Asia, it was absolutely critical that tomorrow's leaders, that's you lot, who bear the responsibility and have the opportunity to lead and develop businesses in the future, need to focus on Asia. Where in the world is Asia? And I can think of few people better qualified to talk about that than Danny Quah, who I've certainly heard speak before, and who will be talking to us for 20 to 25 minutes or so, and then we very value the Q&A session. Danny Quah, for those who don't know, is a senior fellow at the LSE and professor of economics, Quah Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He served as head of the department from 2006 to 9. He holds degrees from Princeton and Harvard and was assistant professor of economics at the MIT before joining the LSE. He has consulted, amongst others, for the World Bank, the Bank of England, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And he lectures frequently in the Gulf region, Southeast Asia, and China. He's also a visiting professor at the National University of Singapore, where he goes for, I think, 2 months a year to lecture. We'll be going there later this year, and served on Malaysia's National Economic Advisory Council from 2009 to 11. And he's a member of the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on Economic Imbalances. He is also a very interesting speaker, a great guy, and we are delighted that he's here. Danny, thank you.
Thank you very much, Roddy, for that wonderful, glowing introduction. I don't know how I'm going to be able to do anything that comes up to the expectations that he has now set up for you. So he set me up to fail this morning. But I hope that in that failure, you and I get to exchange some interesting ideas about, as was said earlier, about opportunities and the challenges in Asia. What I study now as an academic is how the global economy is shifting, what the challenges that are being thrown up, not just for those economies that are growing, the Chinas and Indias and the East Asian economies in the world, but the challenges that their growth throws up for those of us who live here in the West, who live in the advanced economies. Because the challenges that we have in mind here need to be challenges not just of what confronts the emerging economies on their home ground, as it were, on their home turf, the challenges that they face, but also the challenges that we, along the transatlantic axis in North America and Western Europe, face as the world grows in the way that it's been doing for the last 3 decades. Now, when we think about East Asia, and we think about how we in the West view East Asia, we are often led to asking, what's gone wrong with Asia? Even as Asia, as we will see in a little while, has been successful in a number of different dimensions, foremost in many observers' minds, when we sit here in the West, is what's gone wrong with it. What's gone wrong with it already? What's gone wrong with it in that it is imminently bound to fail? It is imminently going to slow down. It will not be as successful as many of the people who view it with rose-tinted glasses suggest to us. And there are at least 3 reasons that Asia, the eastern part of the world, the emerging economies more generally, could potentially be bound for failure. These 3 reasons are reasons in common across many of the fast-growing emerging economies. Again, not just in Asia, but notably in Asia, but they're present to some degree elsewhere in the world in emerging economies. The first of these is that Asia has overinvested. It has grown merely through the easy act of accumulating too much capital. The systems, the political and economic systems in these countries, in China, before it in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in countries like that, they've grown through what economists think of as just the accumulation of factors. So they've squeezed their people. They've extracted high savings from their people. Singapore extracted high savings from its citizens through an employee provident fund, through a pension fund. Malaysia, in this interpretation, has done the same thing. China, through other means, is doing the same thing. It's extracting high savings from its people through financial repression, through not allowing financial markets to develop fully, through extracting, inflicting on its people savings, negative interest rates, moving those resources into the business community, into the control of the government, and then the business community or the government goes out and it spends on investment. And this overinvestment is pushing the economy in a direction where these economies are overcapitalized, they've overaccumulated capital. This is something that cannot be sustained. So the critics, those who say this is one of the huge challenges, one of the huge risks that doing business in Asia entails, they point to a firm set of evidence. They say, well, look, Asia today, China in particular, invests close to 50% of its GDP. That's a figure that Jared Lyons might have referred to as well in his talk. Jared, among other people, have documented how China today saves and invests 48% of its GDP. And rightly, they point to the observation that no country in all of recorded history has been able to sustain growth through the mere act of capital accumulation alone. At an earlier time, 10, 20 years ago, economists like Paul Krugman and Alwyn Young pointed to how Singapore had been doing the same thing. Singapore had been running a rapid growth program through high savings and low wages. It was growth through extracting sweat and blood from its peoples, growth through making them consume not so much but save more and therefore invest. It was growth that was akin to a Stalinist type accumulation of factors of production. And that's a challenge. That continues to be a challenge for Asia. So these observers contend. What you and I will do is look at some of the facts on that when we think about opportunities. But for those who want to invest in Asia, who want to do business with Asia, who want to potentially go work in Asia, or move back to Asia, set up businesses there, is Asia sitting on a time bomb of overinvestment, of overaccumulating physical capital so that growth is bound to slow, and when it slows, all of this will be to its undoing. So we need to check on that. Is overinvestment really part of what's gone wrong with Asia? And the numbers seem to support that. The 48% number, all of that suggests that Asia is bound for a dangerous slowdown, for a dangerous crash. Pursuing that line, that there's something profoundly, fundamentally wrong with the growth path of Asia, is Asia overly dependent on exporting to the West? Is Western consumption the engine of growth for Asia's development? Okay. In financial market terms, is Asia a high beta play? Is Asia's growth strongly correlated with growth in the 70% of the global economy that is the transatlantic axis? And if it is that high beta play, what that means almost surely is that as the West continues to work through its deleveraging, through its period of austerity, through a recession that has continued for the last 4 or 5 years now, surely if Asia is over-dependent on exporting to the West, Asia has got to slow down. And indeed, this is very real. When we look at Asia's trade numbers, we see that Asia exports 80%, 90%, China perhaps even higher, to the advanced economy. So maybe this high beta criticism is correct, and we need to be wary of that as one of the risks that Asia faces. And finally, let me turn to the third large risk, that Asia is sitting on a demographic time bomb. How does that argument go? Observers point to what they think of as the demographic dividend. They say that when we look around the world, those economies that grow fast and sustain economic growth, they're economies with young populations. As Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook said, young people, they're just smarter. They're entrepreneurial, they've got energy, they're the ones who make things happen, right? And it's true. I look around the students at the LSE, they are on the go a lot more than my doddering old colleagues on the faculty. Right? And it's true, they have that entrepreneurial spirit. Perhaps that entrepreneurial spirit is the demographic dividend that has driven growth in Asia, elsewhere, for some part of recent history. That is what drove growth in the United States in the early part of its history. If that's the case, if the demographic dividend is really what matters, it's really what's important for driving growth, well then, Asia is sitting on a time bomb because Asia's population is rapidly aging. China's one-child growth policy, while it might have seemed sensible at the beginning, is now leading to a situation where the demographic profile in China, but not just in China, but China most clearly because of its one-child policy, is tilting towards having lots of old people. And lots of old people, well, the state's got to support them. They're no longer productive members of the workforce. They're no longer give the entrepreneurial drive and enthusiasm. Growth in Asia is bound to slow down because it's sitting on a demographic time bomb. It has lost the advantage from the demographic dividend. So these are three large risks that Asia faces. And for those of us, whether we live in Asia, as I do part of the time, or whether we sit here along the transatlantic axis as I do the rest of the time and look at Asia as providing possible opportunities, these are risks that we all need to worry about. So I stand before you to try and understand these risks, to take us through a discussion of these risks. But I'll tell you the conclusion that I'm going to come to. The conclusion I'm going to come to is that these risks are real, but they are potentially overplayed. There's lots of reasons to think that while these risks are indeed correct, given the numbers that we see out there are other ways to think about this, and there's other evidence you and I need to bring to bear on this that suggests that at the end of this all, this is overplayed. So let's go through the reasoning about why these risks have potentially been overemphasized. They're too much of a presence in people's minds, in investors' minds, and that's holding us back. That Asia, in my view, still has enormous growth potential, that while we recognize these risks, they have been overemphasized. So let's take us through some of the alternative evidence, the evidence that perhaps is not so well known when people think about the risks in Asia or in China. So this is a chart that a former student of mine constructed using data from a variety of sources. And we decided to look at this question, has Asia overinvested? So sure enough, China in particular is investing close to 50% of its GDP. That's absolutely right. But we thought maybe what matters is not investment as a ratio of GDP, but perhaps investment as a ratio of the population that you've got in your economy. Because when you stop and think about it, what economic theory or common sense tells me is that a country or an economy is overcapitalized when the number of machines per worker has gotten too high. Right? When we think about economies that are overinvested, we shouldn't be thinking about abstract numbers like investment as a ratio of GDP. What we really need to come down to is when someone sits down to work, when the average person sits down to work in an economy, how many machines are they having to deal with? Overcapitalization is when there are too many machines around them for them to be effectively, efficiently using those machines. Overcapitalization has to do with numbers per worker, not rates of investment per unit of GDP. So when you unpack the numbers, here's what you find. This is per capita investment. So stepping away from investment per unit of GDP, look at investment per worker, investment per person. And then when you look at that, well, one striking thing is the number for the United States is this blue line. So that's a high number. And it's true there are parts of Asia, like Japan, that have high investment per GDP. So high numbers of machines per unit of worker. Where does China figure in this spectrum? Well, China's down here. China's this green line down here. And it's true that most recently, China's investment has continued to rise. But when you look at its investment per person, per worker, it is about 1/5 to 1/7 that we see in the advanced economies. Has China overinvested? Is it overcapitalized relative to its workforce, relative to a workforce that can effectively use these machines? The answer has to be no, not according to these numbers. China's investment per person is a tiny fraction of investment per person elsewhere in the world, notably in the advanced rich economies. True, as Jared Lyons and other people point out correctly, Martin Wolf and others as well, that China's investment per GDP is high, but what's more relevant is its investment per person. Okay? Its investment per person remains low. Let's square these numbers. You know, the observers who point out about China's potential overinvestment, when they look at investment per unit of GDP, per unit of income that economy generates, they've got their numbers right. Nothing in this picture says that they've done a calculation wrong. It simply says that, well, part of the reason that investment GDP ratio for China is high is because, believe it or not, even for an economy that's already the #2 economy in the world, China's GDP is actually relatively low, in the sense that the number of people who are potential workers in China is still huge. It's still 4 times that of the United States. Okay, so when we look at China's investment per GDP numbers, we need to look at that in the context of how much investment per person is actually occurring in China, and that remains low. So put that another way. The critics who say that China has overinvested, China or Asia generally, outside of rich countries already like Japan, the critics who say East Asia has already overinvested, have in mind a picture. That picture is one that they say, well, you know, overcapitalization, that's what happens then is that when you take the average worker in East Asia or China and you plunk them down at their workplace, at the average workplace, they've got so many machines around them, the state has overinvested, that they can't effectively use these machines. The numbers that when you actually look at them say, well, you've been looking at the wrong numbers. If that's the right picture, if that's the picture you need to be thinking about. Are workers in East Asia, in China, already faced with an excess of capital? The answer is no. This picture shows that. The next picture from the Economist newspaper shows that as well. When you look at China's capital stock per worker, or East Asia's capital stock per worker, it'll be roughly the same. They're way down here. Capital stock to people for economies like the United States or Japan are much higher. The rich parts of Asia, the rich parts of the world, do have a high capital stock per person. But most of East Asia, economies like China, still very low, still lots of upside in terms of being able to invest more. So how do I evaluate this risk of East Asia having overinvested, being overcapitalized, emerging Asia being overcapitalized? I would degrade that risk. I just don't think it is a large risk when you look at the numbers this way. Okay. Put that more bluntly, China today, East Asia, and the same statement can be made of East Asia, but let me confine it to China. China today has 200 million people, half the population of the United States, half the population of Western Europe, these 200 million people are so undercapitalized, they're living on less than $1 a day. Okay. Their income is so low because there's so little capital, so few machines they've got around them for them to be able to raise their income, raise their average productivity. They're living on less than $1 a day. If we had that situation in either the United States or Western Europe, if we looked around us and we said half our population have so few machines around them, they're living on less than $1 a day, we would be saying, good gosh, give them some capital so that they can become productive. Make the state invest so that these people can go to work in factories, go to work at something that makes them more productive than they're just scratching the earth around them to earn less than $1 a day. We would say, have a massive investment program. We don't. By the same token, we should be thinking China and emerging Asia needs that investment program still. Okay. So on the first of the scorecard in terms of risks, I just don't think overinvestment is a problem. Let's turn to the second issue, that East Asia is living on the edge of collapse because it is a high beta play in financial market parlance. It exports so much to the West, and when the West slows down, it will have to slow down. Let's look at what actually happened in the 5 years since the collapse of Lehman Brothers. So this shows absolute change in GDP from different parts of the world, absolute change at market valued exchange rates. So basically, this is how much have these countries contributed to world economic growth? Not in terms of funny purchasing power parity adjusted dollars, but in actual market value dollars, so dollars that can buy Boeing jet airliners, buy Italian fashion, buy French design, actual contribution to trade in the world. Okay? Who's actually done their part for boosting the global economy? Well, look at the 10 largest contributors to world economic growth. Right there in the 5 years since 2007. Well, right there, number one is actually China. China, this country that the critics say is living on the edge because it exports, it depends so much on exporting to the West. Well, hey, you know, the West slowed down. The West went through this massive financial crisis. China continued to grow. China grew by $4.5 trillion in the 5 years following the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And that growth did not come from the United States being a massive contributor to world economic growth, because US growth was less than that in Japan. US growth was only about a third of what China did. And when you look across the top 10 contributors to world economic growth over this period, when the West slowed down, when the East was this high beta play, it was actually not supposed to be able to continue to grow. Actually, it was the BRIC economies and East Asia and Australia and Canada that continued to push the world economy along, even as Western Europe basically dragged the rest of the world down. So does China or East Asia or the BRIC economies or the emerging economies remain a high beta play? No. Actually, they continue to power growth, global growth, even as the West has slowed down. But critics will sometimes, some critics look at this picture and say, oh wait, you know, this is all distorted, isn't it? Because didn't China put in a massive fiscal stimulus? And that massive fiscal stimulus is what got them to grow. The truth of the matter is, the whole world tried to put in a massive fiscal stimulus. What this picture shows is that in some countries it worked, in some other countries it did not. And the fact that it worked at all already tells us that China, East Asia no longer remains a high beta play. And that's actually a good thing, because as the West, as the developed economies continue to struggle with our problems of debt overhang, sovereign debt crises, German tensions within the Eurozone, as we continue to deal with these problems, Asia is continuing to power ahead. That we thought Asia relied on growth along the transatlantic axis was just yet another illusion that we need to dispel. It is no longer the case. It might have been true 30 years ago, no longer the case. In fact, today, Germany exports more to developing Asia than it does to the United States. Okay? So if we have in mind a picture of how Asia is growing because it's producing so much stuff, it's what Martin Wolf calls, the factory of the world, the manufacturing center of the world, and all that stuff is being produced. Its own people aren't rich enough to consume that. It sends all this stuff to the transatlantic axis, to Western Europe, to the United States. That's the nature of the global economy. That's why China and East Asia are high beta play. Well, actually, surprise. Actually, the successful advanced economies in the world today are the ones that send what they make over to East Asia, not the other way around. Because, for instance, when you look at countries like Germany, a successful advanced economy, yes, the United States in this blue line, this shows the size of the Germans' export markets in the United States, and the United States outside of the Eurozone, the United States in the blue line used to be Germany's largest export market. Again, I emphasize outside of the Eurozone, and that went along nicely. But you also notice that China as an export market for Germany in the purple line had been rising strongly. Developing Asia, it's not just a China story. It's not just a China play. Developing Asia similarly, so that when the collapse of the United States as an export market for Germany occurred after the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, actually developing Asia and China stepped right up to the plate. They very conveniently picked up Germany's exports after the United States collapsed as a German export market. So now what sustains Germany's export performance is not the flow of goods and services west, but actually the flow of goods and services as exports east. This picture that that East Asia is the manufacturing warehouse for the world and then sends out stuff to the rest of the world, and that's the only reason Asia continues to grow, Asia is a high beta play, is just no longer correct. It's no longer accurate. So this, as a second risk factor, may be overplayed. In my view, has been well overplayed, but I leave it up to you, the audience, to weigh up this evidence and come to your own conclusion. But certainly, we can no longer conclude that, we can no longer say with a straight face that East Asia is a high beta play, it grows only because the West consumes. No longer the case. Okay, finally, let me turn to the third large risk factor, and then let me just conclude this discussion more generally by looking broadly at the state of the world. Okay, so the third risk factor, the young people, old people risk factor. Okay, and indeed, for people in Asia, people in China especially, this particular risk factor is one that they've known and been trying to come to terms with for at least a decade now. A Chinese sociologist 15 years ago coined this phrase, which translated means grow old before it gets rich. So the worry was that China as a society, because of the one-child policy, because of the slowing population, was going to grow old before it had gotten rich enough to be a developed economy. And so it had lost the advantage from the demographic dividend. It was instead facing a ticking time bomb in its demography. And other observers have pointed out, George Magnus, who is a banker at UBS, a noted observer of the global economy, he's written books and spoken greatly, convincingly, about how China faces this time bomb. And so it is a dangerous situation. And when you look at the facts are indeed scary. Among other things, China will, within 10 years, have 340 million old people, pensioners, retired people who are no longer in the workforce the same way that young people are. And when you look across the list of credible numbers which China and East Asia fully accept, this is possibly a danger. Okay, it's true. What is my counter to this particular risk factor? What are the things I think we should think about as a way to round off the discussion more generally? What is the other side of this? Well, we look around the world. It is true that in many historical growth experiences, having an infusion, having an injection of young people did propel growth in those economies. Many of those growth experiences happened at a time when, economic activity involved actual hard work, it involved manual labor. We know that we live in a 21st century where knowledge matters, where the highest value created comes from the third C of Jared Lyons' description, the creativity. And actually, my spelling is terrible, I'm going to say knowledge also begins with a C, where, we actually need what it is. It's a knowledge-driven economy out there. And old people, contrary to what Mark Zuckerberg's, characterization might suggest, old people are actually useful sources of productive knowledge for doing business, for doing economic activity. And the idea that it's only old people that drive the world, I think needs to be re-examined in a knowledge-driven economy. Moreover, China, if it just as quickly put in place a one-child policy that distorted the demographic pyramid, it could, and it's already something that's being discussed, it could just as easily feel that economic development has proceeded to a point where it can overturn that policy and it can swing that around. No question, the one-child policy has led to a serious distortion in terms of a gender imbalance. There will very soon, there already is, between 25, 30 million more young men in China than there are young women, and that is a problem. But that points us the way ahead. The problem with the one-child policy or the changing demography in China, but also in India, also in East Asia, there's almost as much of a gender imbalance in India, which does not have a one-child policy, as there is in China. The problem with that is exactly that, the gender imbalance. But that also makes us think that perhaps the problem with the demography argument is not the old people, young people argument, but it's the young men, young women argument. And that really what makes economies successful, stable, sustainable is a stock of productive, engaged, economically active women rather than angry young men. Angry young men, I don't know who said that, but angry young men who might not be able to find jobs, who might not be able to find spouses. If we've got millions of them wandering the streets, that's a dangerous situation, and that is the problem, not the old people problem. I'm not just saying that because I'm rapidly becoming old. I'm saying that because I think that that really is the way the world works. So we look around the world. What are the countries that still have a potential demographic dividend? Well, I'll tell you. Another part of the world I study, the Middle East, the Gulf region. That's a region that's still in the early stages of this demographic transition. They've still got lots of young people. Okay? They have a problem where many of these young people are not going to be able to find jobs. They have a problem where many of these young people are not in a position where their human capital makes them easily employable. So the Middle East and North Africa, according to the IMF, will very soon have 100 million young people added to the workforce that aren't able to find satisfying, productive jobs that they will be happy with. The region will, over the next 10 years, need to create at least 60 million new jobs, and nobody has any idea where these jobs are going to come from. So this is an opposite problem. This is a part of the region where those who think demographic dividend always does wonders need to rethink, because the Middle East, North Africa region, is a region where we will have lots of young people, but no jobs. And so political stability is a massively important ingredient for stable economic growth. So I suggest that when we think about old people, we also need to think about this problem. Are we when we live in a society, is it a society, a growing society, is it going to be stable, conducive to economic growth, or the opposite, risky, because we've got 340 million old people practicing Tai Chi in the park, or because we've got 150 million angry young people who can't find jobs? And I think that the greater danger is actually in societies today, in the way the world works now. The greater risk is in this part of the world for political instability rather than this part of the world where people are just doing the 24 form in Tai Chi. Okay. Now I'm caricaturing this to make the point, and that point is a very simple one. Demographic dividend, demographic time bomb, yes, risk factor. But hey, there are lots of facets to that, and I don't find myself convinced that this risk factor is going to be overwhelming. Okay, that concludes the discussion about risk. If I can I take a few more minutes just to round off our discussion more generally. I've told you about risks. I've tried to be upfront about what the big risks are. And those of you in the audience who believe that these risks are overwhelming, perhaps nothing I will be able to say will overturn that view. But if you're willing to entertain the possibility that these same risk factors contain within them opposing forces, I hope I've been able to put a little bit of evidence and argument against that. But more generally, when you look around the world, how is the world changing? What are the opportunities for us? Well, okay, so rounding off all of this discussion now, coming to the end of this presentation, the German Marshall Foundation goes around and asks people in different parts of the world, what do you think is going on in the world? And one of the questions they ask is, where in the world is going to be the most important region for your national interest in the next 10, 20 years? So when they go to different countries in the world, Asia, they ask this country, they ask the United States, they ask people in the European Union. So they then tabulate this. And one of the tabulations, the interesting tabulations, is they count up the number of people in the United States, in the European Union, who consider Asia the most important region for their national interest. The fact that you're sitting here suggests that you would answer, yes, Asia is the most important region for our national interest when we're thinking about what's going on here. And indeed, when you look at the United States among young people, people in the age group 18 to 24, the Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook age group, the one that's supposed to be driving the demographic dividend high productivity, when you ask those people, 3/4 of them say that Asia is the most important region for their national interest. In contrast, old Europe, in the sense old Europe with perhaps older views about the world, only 41% say Asia. So young people, where do they look for important for national interest? If you are American, 3/4 of you will be looking to Asia. Now this is a select group, so many of you will still be answering Asia, but what the German Marshall Foundation found was that only 41% of Europeans in this 18 to 24 age group think that Asia is the most important region for their national interest. Where else do they think? Perhaps some of them think the United States still, because perhaps they still have this view of the world that says everywhere in the world is a high beta play relative to the United States. If the United States sneezes, the rest of the world catches the cold, so we better pay attention to what's happening in the US. So that's the situation out there. But the Americans, if you think that they're the ones who drive entrepreneurial, they're the ones who form the economic landscape of the future, well, they're all looking east now. They're all looking to Asia. And all of that, I think, is good news. But here's the bad news. The bad news is a little bit hidden here, but let me tell you the upshot. The upshot is, if you ask Americans, do you consider the rise of China, the rise of Asia, a threat or an opportunity? Well, double the number of Americans say threat than say opportunity. Okay. Over 66% of Americans say that the rise of Asia, the rise of China, presents a threat to them, to the world, rather than say it's an opportunity for the world. So here's the situation. Yes, 3/4 of Americans think that the rise of, that China is where the future of their national interest is. But hey, you know, that question did not say, is that future a positive one or a negative one? It simply said, where does the future depend on? And in this second question, it turns out that more Americans, double the number of Americans, think that this rise of the East, rise of Asia, rise of China is a threat rather than an opportunity. So we look around and we say, you know, those three risk factors that we discussed a little bit earlier, okay, we understand how to contextualize them. But here's a new risk factor. Lots of Americans, lots of Westerners, lots of people living along the transatlantic axis that the German Marshall Foundation surveyed think that the rise of the East is a threat, think that the rise of China is a threat. And here is another large risk factor because, you know, when you live in a world where a huge chunk of the world thinks another part of the world is a threat, that, in my view, is a massive risk factor. That, in my view, is a dangerous situation. So this world that we're living in, where economic activity is mapped out in this picture that shows a satellite photograph taken of our Earth at night. And the reason it's interesting in our discussion is that when you look at the Earth at night, you can't see anything except where people live and where people play. You see people going out to dinners, you see people going out clubbing, that shows up as lights in the nighttime sky. But at this global scale, where people live and where they play is also where they work. And where they work and where they create value and add wealth. And in this picture, we see, yes, there is an emergence of East Asia, but most of the global economy remains firmly stuck along the transatlantic axis, remains in the United States or Western Europe. And with apologies to my friends from Australia and New Zealand, most of those two countries are simply dark relative to what can be seen from outer space. Macroeconomic activity, just couldn't tell there's anything going on in Australia. Australia on this scale is as dark as the continent of Africa. There's so little activity relative to the land around them. Most of the action in this picture is along the transatlantic axis, Western Europe and the United States. But this is a picture taken 30 years ago, and actually this picture is changing. If we think about what this picture is, what it suggests is that the center of world economic activity is a point on the transatlantic axis. If you pull this apart and you do calculations that try and drill down to where economic activity is located, well, the center of the world 30 years ago was a point in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, about halfway between the United States and Western Europe, halfway between North America and Western Europe. And the rest of the world, yes, the Australians and New Zealands, fine places where people enjoy themselves, but in terms of a pull on where the world economy is, just does not figure. And in fact, China did not figure, but this was 30 years ago. And the world has changed. This is how the world has changed. The world's economic center is being pulled year after year eastwards by the rise of the East. So if you look at if you try and balance out where the world's economic activity is occurring now, that there's a pull being exerted by the rise of the East. So this is the world's center of gravity. So if you calculate where economic activity occurs on Earth, there are about 700 locations that you can find measurable economic activity, and you track them over time. Well, 30 years ago, most of the economic activity was about 50% in North America, 50% in Western Europe, so the world's center of gravity was about halfway between them. No longer the case, because the world's economic center has now drifted 5,000 kilometers east. I'll slow down. I'll just freeze this picture. The black dots that are shown here show history that has already transpired. From the dynamic that you could see, what's happened in the world is that the world's economic center began 30, 40 years ago in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. By last year, the world's economic center had been pulled eastwards 5,000 kilometers from west of London and Edinburgh to east of London and Edinburgh, across the entire length of the Mediterranean Ocean. The world's economic center of gravity last year sat about in the Arabian Peninsula, sat in the Gulf region. And if that dynamic continues, it doesn't shoot off into the Pacific Ocean, but it ends. It ends up clustered within the next 20 years on a point on the India-China boundary. So the world's economic center will be on a longitude that cuts through Southeast Asia. It'll have been pulled eastwards by economic activity in Japan, in China, and in India. And while the United States and Western Europe will still be very rich parts of the world, they will no longer be, or they ought to no longer be, the dominant players. That is the way the world is going, given the risk factors that we've articulated. Now, I've used up quite a lot of time, and I know I hope people will want to have questions and answers, so let me jump right to the point. What we've done here is document how the world's most populous economies, China, East Asia, have also been the world's fastest growing economies. They've also been the ones that pushed the world's center of gravity eastwards. Now, Kishore Mahbubani, who's the dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School at the National University of Singapore, about 20 years back, said, when you look around the world and you appreciate how difficult economic development is, even in small economies like Singapore, even in small economies that we can manage with just a few million people, or even with 60 million people. These are small economies. We think about how running economic policy difficult is here, and getting growth going is in these economies. Well, then when you think about how the world's most populous regions, China with 1.3 billion people, India with another 1.3 billion, East Asia contributing close to another billion people. And you realize these are also the fastest growing parts of the world. It's like realizing all of a sudden that the fattest kid in school just won the 110-meter hurdles. Right? The fattest kid in school has just transformed the global economy. And the risk factors that are associated with that are large, but they don't come from the usual directions that we think they come from. So thank you very much.
Danny, thank you very much indeed. I think the Q&A part now, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I'm going to ask one in just a second, but when you come to ask a question, there is a mic there. The reason for it isn't that I can't hear you, but so that we can capture your very pertinent question on the sound recording. And if you could very kindly, when you ask a question, just say who you are and where you're from, that would be helpful. Danny, I'd like to start off by asking you a question. We haven't talked about other geopolitical risks. There is a very, very dangerous part of Asia at the moment called North Korea. I think that even China is very disillusioned with its policy of trying to control that. And as you and I were talking as we drove in from the airport yesterday, sometimes you can judge quite carefully and measure the capabilities of countries and people and companies, but it's trying to figure out their intentions, which is difficult. In a room here are people who, before them, have the opportunity to work in Asia, to build businesses, which is what the Asia-Scotland Institute's all about, reigniting that spirit in the Scots particularly and others to do business in that part of the world. Tell us what you think, what the hell is going on, where almost the fattest leader in the world is playing a very dangerous game.
Yes, the sexiest man alive, according to a spoof website. Okay, what's happening in North Korea? North Korea and South Korea is a very scary thing. I think beyond that, we can only speculate what the dynamics of that is. I think the danger flashpoint in potential conflict between the two parts of Korea is now flashing red, and at a rapidity higher than it's been and than it's done for the last 3-4 decades. What has brought us to this point? Just when it seemed like North Korea was having a new leader who had been trained in the West, who was familiar with how things are done in the rest of the world, just when it seemed like Eastern Europe has gone through its transition, has become part of the global economy, China was opening its doors and was being an example to North Korea for how it too could proceed, just when all that seemed to be moving in the right direction, all of a sudden North Korea has become belligerent in a way that we hadn't seen for a long time. How has this come about? Well, I think part of the calming influence in North Korea for a long time had actually paradoxically been China. China, in its consistent, persistent support for North Korea against the rest of the world, provided North Korea a way to connect with the rest of the world. And it was a way that then also gave North Korea lessons on how it too might transform its economy from a pre-1979 China to the modern China. And all of that seemed fine, while the rest of us in the West, the rest of the world, heavily criticized China for its refusing to sanction North Korea or to speak sternly to North Korea. Actually, I think what was happening was that China was providing a calming influence. And then last month, February last month, North Korea ran some nuclear tests. And at that point, even China turned around and sided with the rest of the world against the North Korean regime and applied sanctions to it. That, paradoxically, just when we think, okay, China did what the rest of the world thought it should have been doing for a long time, it finally came around to the view that North Korea had to be talked to sternly. But I think that pushed North Korea over the edge. And North Korea felt isolated in a way that it hadn't been for decades, and it just lost the plot. It lost the plot and has begun to rattle its sabers against South Korea. I think that makes for a very, very dangerous situation. I mean, Roddy, you're the military person. You're the one with insights on this. I would like to get your views on what's happening in North Korea.
Well, I was the military person. I think it's an extremely dangerous situation, and I've always believed that dialogue, when you're talking, is likely to prevent war. The difficulty with North Korea has been that there hasn't been a dialogue, or if there has, it's been a dialogue of the deaf. I think there that the United States of America, we talk about US attitudes to Asia, we have to remember that a very substantial part of the United States of America is Asia-Pacific facing. Yes. Obama's strategy, this administration, is more geared toward the Asia-Pacific. And I think the United States of America are deeply concerned about North Korea as a flashpoint, and I believe that they know the importance of trying to engage in dialogue with these people, and I think that will happen. Again, as we were saying in yesterday, the two of us when we were talking, what resulted in the fall of the Soviet Union was the realization of people living in that part of the world that they simply were not getting the benefits or the lifestyle that those in the West were getting. If it was a way of communicating with North Korea, so the people of North Korea who were in dire economic straits understood what it was that they could have if they had a more open government. In the way that I think even in China, people in parts of China realize that now, it would result in the collapse of the regime eventually.
No, I'm in complete agreement on this point. But there also I would go back to how China provided that telescope by which North Korea could see what life was like elsewhere in the world. China was always much more acceptable as a regime, as a government, as a country to the North Koreans than, say, the Americans, who were viewed as on the other side of belligerence. China could have provided that model. And indeed, China does want to have all the same material comforts that the rest of the world does. And so I think that is really especially important, not just for the well-being of people in China, but as an example for the rest of East Asia, an example for North Korea, that China be able to continue its growth trajectory.
I agree. Now, questions from the floor, of which I'm sure there will be many. Gentleman at the back there. Again, if you could just say who you are and where you're from.
Hi there. Govinda Finn, Standard Life Investments. Can I just ask you about Japan, and particularly the apparent support of the US for Abenomics? and just whether that is a factor of the US being more assertive in Asia or not.
Okay, good question. Would you like to take 2 or 3, or should I just take them one at a time?
Well, why don't you take one, and then we'll take 2 or 3 the next time round.
Okay,
So let's get
all
the
right.
gauges.
So this is a question from the man from Standard Life about Japan and Abenomics. You know, as the U.S. and in particular how we think about what's going on in the U.S., how it's going on in Japan, is also a way to discern the intentions of the United States towards the region. Okay. There was also reference to Abenomics, which is the collection of economic policies that the new Prime Minister, Abe, elected in December of last year, has begun to roll out. Okay. It's an interesting cluster of developments going on in Japan. The kinds of economic policies that Abe has been pushing turn on a number of dimensions. One, trying to get the central bank to commit to a 2% target rate of inflation, trying to get greater fiscal expansion going to the order of trillions of yen, at a time when China's national debt to GDP ratio is already 200%, higher than that in most of Western Europe and most of the other countries where we think they're already facing a debt crisis, a debt overhang crisis, a sovereign debt problem. It's a mixture of almost textbook Keynesian aggregate demand management policies against a background of almost an arch-nationalist right-wing political orientation in the new Abe cabinet. The new Abe cabinet promotes and proposes a range of measures that, among other things, from the West looks like a denial of the militarism in Japanese history, a disputing that the last 50 years of pacifist-oriented post-war regime has been beneficial for Japan. So it's revisionist politically in ways that the rest of the world would look at and say, okay, right-wing government. But at the same time, it's pushing a collection of economic policies, monetary policies, fiscal expansion policies, attempting to withdraw the independence of Japan's central bank. They're almost textbook Keynesian. So it's so textbook Keynesian that you get writers like Paul Krugman standing up and applauding Abenomics. So it's a very peculiar configuration of things. One of the ideas that's circulating about what's happening in Japan is that these are policies that are floated out there, even though they're inconsistent with the deep political beliefs of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, because the Prime Minister needs to win a majority in the upper house of the Diet. Although they won a landslide in December of last year, that landslide really came about not because of an endorsement of the Liberal Democratic Party, but rather a denial, but rather a slap in the face to the previous government, to the DPJ. So that's the landscape against which we need to evaluate what's going on here. So going forwards, does Abenomics have enough content and belief and will, political will to it, that will actually be implemented and will go forwards? Or will, if they do win the upper house, will they retreat back to policies that apply fiscal rectitude, that are austere, that again lead to Japan deflating for another 10, 15 years? It's a difficult question to think about how it is going forwards. I place a lot of credibility to the idea that there is some political manipulation going on, and there's some of a wait-and-see attitude on what's going to happen after the elections. If these policies that have been already announced in terms of Abenomics does continue to push forwards, then I think there are still questions to be asked. I think there's a first round of questions to be asked about what their intentions really are. A second round of questions, if their intentions are as they've been announced on this, what are they doing about supply side issues? What are they doing about productivity? What are they doing about reform of the business sector? What are they doing about clearing out bad bank debts that continue to be a problem, has been a problem for the last 20 years? So I think there's still questions to ask, to pose towards Abe and his economic team before we can be clear about whether they will actually come out of the lost decades that they've already had.
Danny, thanks. That was a good question. Now, we might take two questions now, perhaps in a cluster. Gentleman here in the middle. Adam.
Thank you. Danny, the talk you gave was amazing and reaffirming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Does
Adam,
anybody else want to ask the same question?
My name's Adam. I run the Power of Youth, which is a global network of entrepreneurs under the age of 35. I just had one very simple question for you, just going through your talk and what we've just discussed about North Korea. Do you think the simple biggest threat to the world at the moment is fear? It's fear that the Americans have, almost an irrational fear that the Americans have of the East, the American populace have of the East. It's the peddling of fear of the American news networks. It's the peddling of fear of Western media to Western people. And it's fear, the insular fear of North Korea, that really is holding the whole human race back at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Excellent question.
I'm really sorry that I have to go to another meeting. It's an amazing talk.
You're going to stay for the answer?
I will stay.
Good.
Okay, thank you.
Was there another question anybody had?
I will ask.
Yes, please do.
I'm Steve Borley from SQA. Thanks for your presentation, Danny. I enjoyed particularly the section on exports, and that's certainly lots of food for thought. What I noticed about the top 10 countries was it seemed to be a lot of those were commodity-driven economies, just as an observation, which. Yeah. But the other was, I'm just interested in the difference of importing and exporting components and finished goods, particularly in China, and if there's any of that is perhaps fogging some of the numbers when you add them up in aggregate, and I just wondered if there was anything that was underlying that.
Thank you. Good question. All right, let me take the two questions.
Fear and facts, right?
Fear and facts about imports, export, trade. Okay. So, Adam, on your point, I agree completely with you that there's a huge threat to the world that surrounds fear and misunderstanding. It's misunderstanding as much as just genuine fear. When I followed the populist rhetoric that had emerged in the run-up to the U.S. presidential elections, I thought that this was something that was very ill thought through, very dangerous for the world. But not to worry, because it'll just go on until November. The elections are over. People will become sensible again. They'll realize they were all in this together. It's not an us versus them. My worry is that populist rhetoric has actually not gone away, that the United States is rapidly closing in on an us versus them mentality. And I think that's a very dangerous situation for the world to be in. So let me just give you one example on this that's based on calculation rather than just perception. The IMF recently ran a study. It's not very well publicized, but it's a study that they'd run on what would happen to the world if China's currency was forced to revalue by some amount, 20% say. So the unspoken presumption in there is that the United States gets its way in G2, G20 discussions, says that the world faces this threat. The threat comes from China undervaluing its currency, so we need to force China to revalue its currency. And wouldn't that be a good thing? Because that would then reduce China's large trade surpluses, it would make the United States and other countries more competitive, it would reduce their trade deficits, it would bring the world back to balance. So the IMF does not describe this as a background, but what they did was a very technocratic calculation. Model the world economy, let's ask what will happen. And here's what they found. They found that China's economy would shrink by 9% over the short to medium term if the RMB revalued by 20%. So it looks like part of what the United States expects will happen, but here's the clincher. What will happen in the United States and Western Europe as a result of this? Absolutely nothing. The impact on GDP, production, employment will be 0.0% in the United States and elsewhere. So what we will have done, if the United States gets its way, is a lot of pain in the world, very little gain. But of course, that calculation is just part of what will go into the discussions that we're going to make. And the geopolitical reality is the fear and misunderstanding about the world could well force an outcome that will lead to huge parts of the world having to retrench, having to shrink, hundreds of millions thrown into unemployment, hundreds of millions of people pushed back into the deepest poverty, and with very little to show for it. That's a huge problem. It's not just a zero-sum game, it's a negative-sum game that the Americans might be playing at this point, the populist rhetoric pushing us through. So I agree with you completely. It's a huge danger. Now, whether that same fear and misunderstanding extends to North Korea, I think is more nuanced. I think that there are other issues we need to discuss there. But in terms of the economics, this fear, this misunderstanding, this retreat into effectively protectionism is terrible for the world. Okay.
Thank you, Danny.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now on Steve's question, top 10 countries, let me just pick up both of the points you made. Top 10 countries, yes, most of them are commodities, and indeed most of them are being driven by growth in the commodity-hungry countries. So those top 10 contributions being driven more than just suggested by China's large presence there. But what that tells me is that the importance of China there is larger than actually appeared, because its commodity hunger is also driving growth elsewhere in the world. And so in terms of this traditional view of the world, consumption in the West drives growth in the East. Well, actually, consumption and production in the East is driving growth in a lot of other places as well. So it's even more important that we don't fall into this protectionist rhetoric for the world, for the global economy. And then your next question was, well, you know, the global chain of production is one that we know lots of things that get added up as exports are really re-exports. So a lot of what shows up as China's exports will really be what China having imported from the rest of the world, put together, and then sent out again. And indeed, I think of this as exemplified by the iPhone problem. A number of journalists and other researchers have documented how when you look at the iPhone is a Western Apple, Cupertino, California product. No one ever thinks anything but that. But the iPhone contributes 100% of its value to the US trade deficit, not its surplus. It shows up as part of the deficit that the United States racks up against China. And here's why. The Apple, iPhone, iPad, the iPods are designed in Cupertino, California. They are manufactured in a global supply chain way, parts in Hungary, parts in the UK, parts in Germany, parts in Israel, all different parts of the world, but they are assembled at the very last stage in Foxconn's factories in Shenzhen, China. So China has to import all of these components, the Bluetooth, GPS receivers, the screens from Kentucky in the United States. It imports all these things. They show as part of China's trade deficit against the rest of the world. But when China puts them together in a $300 US wholesale package and sends it to New York or San Francisco, 100% of those $300 shows up as the US trade deficit against China. China actually gets to keep only 4% of this value. So it's like the worst of all possible worlds. Because in terms of US populist rhetoric, my goodness, the US trade deficit against China is so large, that's a negative in terms of the protectionist dangers. What does China get out of having to take the heat from the rest of the world in terms of running this large trade deficit? 4%. It gets to keep 4% of the gains. It takes 100% of the heat. So the situation is actually a lot worse than the trade numbers suggest. But I'm saying that even when we take that into account, it's already the case that China's trade exports to the United States and elsewhere, China's trade, when you look at China's trade numbers, China's exports to the advanced economies, including the United States, as a fraction of China's overall exports, that has fallen 10 percentage points in the last 15 years. So even with this iPhone problem, China is already getting its trade exports to the developed economies down. And China, together with the rest of East Asia, together with Japan and South Korea, are developing a growth cluster that is the strong performance, that's a strong performing growth cluster. Yeah.
Now, I'm conscious of the time, so what I'm going to suggest is that anybody who wants to leave in a second can do so after I thank Danny. There are plenty of opportunities to talk with him. What I would just like to say in conclusion, in thanking Danny enormously, is that The question about fear, the question about facts, the issue to do with understanding sits at the centre of what we are doing and will do in the future at the Age of Scotland Institute. I believe that increased understanding, developed from experience of listening to people like Danny and others speaking, is the biggest enemy, if you like, of preconceived ideas, of bigotry, and of fear. You're quite right, knowledge should begin with a C. And I hope that, and I believe that, in this smallish gathering today, you have had an opportunity to hear some extraordinarily interesting facts that should enhance and increase your knowledge of one of the most important parts of the world. And in thanking Danny for talking to you, I would also like to thank again the Business School of the University of Edinburgh, and I would like to thank all of you for coming and participating in what has been a really interesting early morning session. So thank you.
Thank you very much.